And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is 20 cards you should be putting in your commander decks. Now, longtime viewers of mine will wonder why this is 20 cards you should be putting in your decks rather than 10, and that is because this is the last episode of this series. That's right. Sadly, I have once again reached the end of the alphabet, and I decided to just crank out the last 20 cards in this episode. For those who don't know, this series started out a long time ago, over a year ago now, where I just did a search of cards available in the format, and originally I picked cards that were not modern legal. Okay, that's why in the first few episodes of this series, I think I got up to 17 episodes the first time through. All the cards were really, really old cards because when I did the search for the cards, I put cards that were not modern legal. So it was all really old cards. And what I realized as I was going through that list is there's a lot of people out there playing this game that for them, modern is really, really old, right? Modern started with Mirrodin block, essentially. For a lot of people, that set is really, really old. For me, it's not. For me, I think of modern as being sort of modern, I guess. But that was a long, long time ago. So once I reached the end of the alphabet, I started back from the beginning with all cards available in the Commander format, and I went through the entire list. I think there's over 23,000 cards now available for us in this format, and I have once again reached the end of the alphabet, so that will be the end of this series. However, I will be doing one more video after this. I'm going to do another 20 cards you should be putting in Commander decks by going back. I'm going to go back and look at all those old videos, and I'm going to pick out the 20 cards out of all the videos I did that I think really, really need some more love. Basically, my favorite from the whole entire series. So let's get to the final 20 cards that I'm going to be talking about in this series, starting out with Felonite Druid, 2 and a green, human cleric druid, 1/1. Pay 1 and a green and tap, sacrifice a creature. Forests you control become 2/3 creatures until end of turn. They're still lands. Now, there are lots of effects like this that turn your lands into creatures. This really is a great one, I think. First of all, it's repeatable, right? It is a repeatable effect that's going to be turning all your forest into 2/3 creatures. That can be really handy. Also, the 2/3 creature is a little different. Usually it's a 2/2, so that could mean something. Also, this guy can sacrifice to himself, right? Even if you don't have any other creatures lying around, you can pay 1 and a green. This guy sacrifices himself and you turn all your lands into 2/3 creatures. There's a few commanders out there that really want this effect of turning your lands into creatures. This is just another option for you. Coming in at number 2, Title Control, 1 green green enchantment, cumulative upkeep 2. That's not great. So of course that means on your upkeep you have to put an age counter on it and then pay the upkeep for each age counter on it. So you're gonna have to pay 2 colorless mana the first time. However, this ability is just insane. Pay 2 life or 2 mana, counter target red or green spell. Any player may activate this ability. Man, this can really throw a wrench into the game plan of anyone who's playing a red or green deck. You don't even have to pay mana for this. You can just pay the 2 life to counter any red or green spell, and any player can do this. And if you're in a deck that's not running red or green, man, there's no downside here. You can just slap this down, and then even once around the table, anyone playing red or green is just basically not going to be able to cast any spells. I talk a little bit about cards that specifically hate on certain colors. This really is one of the best, I think. You can completely shut down a green deck with this if you have the life to pay for it. This can be brutal for some decks in a commander game. Next up, we got Trade Routes, a card that is kind of well known, maybe not, I'm not sure. It is kind of a unique effect in what it's doing. 1 and a blue enchantment. Pay 1, return a land you control to owner's hand, and you can pay 1 and discard a land card to draw cards. So this is sort of a, I don't know, landfall, land discard theme in mono blue, which you don't see a lot. If you have a deck in blue that is doing a lands theme, this card can just be super, super handy because it is allowing you to both return lands to your hand that you can use for maybe landfall triggers, also allowing you to discard lands to draw cards. But just in any deck, this can be pretty good because later in a game, if I'm drawing lands off the top, which can be pretty useless, I can discard them to draw cards. It can also be good in a discard theme as well. And if you're really desperate, later in a game, you can start picking up those lands and then discarding them to draw cards if you're looking for answers. Coming in at number 4, Triassic Egg. This is a really unique one. 4 mana artifact. Pay 3 and tap. Put a hatchling counter on Triassic Egg. Sacrifice Triassic Egg. Choose one. Activate only if there are 2 or more hatchling counters on it. So in order to sacrifice it to use these abilities, you have to have at least 2 hatchling counters on it, which means you have to use the ability twice, unless you have a proliferate effect, which is also great. I used to have this in a Peer and Toothy deck because I only had to activate it once, and then I could immediately use it. What are you getting out of it though when you sacrifice it? You may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That's pretty good. Or you may return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Both really, really great effects. And particularly why I'm giving this a mention is because it is a colorless option for creature recursion, which in a lot of colors they can't do, right? Black and white are pretty good at creature recursion. Green can get stuff out of your graveyard to your hand. Red and blue can't really do this at all. So if you're in a red or blue deck and there is a creature you want to get out of the graveyard, like say you have some of those dragons from Neon Dynasty that have dice triggers and you want to get them back out of the graveyard, this could be a great way to do it. It's a little expensive, but it is an option for creature recursion in a colorless form. Speaking of creatures, we got Uncaged the Menagerie, X green, green sorcery. Search your library for X creature cards with different names that each have mana value X. Reveal them and put them into your hand. And I remember when this card first came out, it was right after I started playing Commander, and I thought, man, this card's going to go in a ton of decks, right? It's doing the different names thing, which of course in Commander is no big deal at all. This card I don't see ever. I don't know if anyone plays it. It is a creature tutor, which is great. Again, the different names thing doesn't hurt you. I think it's a great card. You're searching for X creature cards with mana value of X. So if you put 2 mana into this, you're going to pay 4 mana to search for 2 creature cards with mana value 2. That's not bad. 3 mana gets you 3 creature cards of mana value 3. That I think is the best because you can get a lot of really neat utility creatures like Eternal Witness or Rex Sage. That's why I like this card. It goes and gets answers. You can go get specific creatures you're looking for, but also you can go get answers to things, which is really great. There's lots of great creatures in green that can solve problems for you, and that's why I particularly like this card. I think it's a pretty good creature tutor in the format. Coming in at number 6, Uba Mask, 4 mana artifact. If a player would draw a card, that player exiles that card face up instead. That is a really powerful effect, right? This is a replacement effect for everybody's draws. That's really, really good. Now, each player may play lands and cast spells from among cards they exiled with Uba Mask this turn. So typically what this is going to do is you're going to draw your card on your draw step like you normally would, but it will get exiled and then you can play it this turn. So it doesn't really hold you back that much. This card famously combos with Dranis Magistrate because now your opponents can't do anything, right? It'll lock you out of the game essentially because you're going to exile those cards. You can't play cards except from your hand. So all the cards your opponents are exiling, they can't actually play. Now, other than that combo, which I don't know if that's necessarily casual, this card can be really great for just hosing strategies, right? I talked about this with Elkin Lair as well, which has a similar effect of exiling cards from a hand that your opponents can play, but what if they don't want to play them, right? What if your opponent exiles a board wipe and they don't want a board wipe right now? That card's just gone. This works really great, just like Elkin Lair against the control deck, where I exile a counterspell off the top of my library. What am I going to do with that on my turn, right? I can't. You can only play the cards exiled this turn. So if they exile a counterspell off the top on their draw step, it's just wasted. It's gone. They're never going to get it back. What if they exile their win con and they're not ready to use it, right? That's gone and they're never going to get it back. This card's really, really good at keeping hands empty, if that's what you're looking for. If you're playing like a Hazoret deck, you don't want a lot of cards in hand. Now those cards are going to get exiled. They're not going to be in your hand, so it keeps your hand minimal as well. And then on top of that, if someone has like that Rhystic Study and they're drawing lots of cards on other opponents' turns, those are going to get exiled instead. This really hates on heavy draw effects, I think, because someone casts a spell on their turn, they don't pay the 1, the Rhystic Study triggers, your opponent, instead of drawing that card and using it at their leisure, it's going to get exiled and now they have to use it right now. And of course, if it's not an instant, they can't use it at all. It just gets exiled, so it will almost completely shut off their Rhystic Study, right? This card has a really powerful effect, and if you're not sort of doing it in a mean combo-y way, it can really slow down a lot of strategies. Coming in at number 7, Delkin Aether Mage, 1 and a blue Delkin Wizard. It's a 1/2, has flash, and get ready for this ability. When Delkin Aether Mage enters the battlefield, return target sliver to its owner's hand. Ooh, baby, hey? Is that ever going to be great against those sliver tribal decks? I don't know if anyone's ever used that ability. In fact, I don't know if anyone's ever actually hard cast to Delkin Aether Mage before. I sure haven't. I've used this card a ton. I've used it in Modern, I've used it in Standard, I've used it in Commander, and the reason why is because it has Wizard Cycling, 3 mana. That's the big one, right? So you discard this card like you normally would with Cycling. You pay the 3, you discard, and then instead of just drawing a card, you're going to search your library for a Wizard card, reveal it, and put it in your hand. So it's a great tutor for Wizards. In any Wizard Tribal deck, it's fantastic, but also if you're in a particular theme where you want a card in your deck that happens to be a Wizard, it's a tutor for that. I actually made a Cycling deck, for example, once, before there was ever any Cycling Commanders. It was a red-blue Cycling deck, and Niv Mizzet was a fantastic fit in that deck because when you're cycling, you're doing a lot of looting, a lot of drawing and discarding, and so you're getting that damage, and Niv Mizzet is a Wizard. So not only was this a cycling card, but also I could cycle it to go get my Niv Mizzet because that was an important card in the deck. Really great option there. Coming in at number 8, a card that I've already mentioned a couple times on my channel, Veilstone Amulet, 3 mana artifact. Whenever you cast a spell, creatures you control can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponent control this turn. This is a really fantastic card for protecting your creatures, especially if you're in a theme that doesn't protect creatures very well, like a mono red deck, for example, or a mono black deck. If you're in those themes, maybe a Voltron strategy in those themes, it's really hard to protect your creatures. So say, for example, you have that Voltron deck and your opponent is holding up a Swords to Plowshares because they're just waiting to see if you're going to attack them so that they can use it on you, which is typically what people do there, right? I just cast a spell on my main phase, and now my opponent has to use the swords right away, right? They can't wait any longer because once that trigger resolves, now my creatures can't be the target of spells or abilities my opponents control for the rest of the turn. So if now I choose to attack and I attack them, it's too late. They can't use that swords anymore. You can also respond, right? If you have a lot of instance in your deck and your opponent goes to target something of yours, you can respond with maybe your own removal spell. Yours will resolve first, this trigger will resolve first, and then their spell will fizzle because now your stuff can't be targeted. Just a really great colorless option for protecting your creatures. Coming in at number 9, Vernal Bloom, 3 and a green enchantment. Whenever a forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional green. I saw this card when I was going through it and I was like, man, I haven't seen this card in forever. I don't know how much people play it anymore. Used to see a lot of play when I first started playing Commander, all those big green decks. Now, of course, it works for your opponents too, but if you're in a mono green deck, typically that's going to be worth it, right? You're going to be creating so much mana, you don't really care what your opponents are doing. So there's an option for you. And for any newer players that haven't really seen this card around because it hasn't been played that much recently, it's a great option for doubling your mana. Coming in at number 10, another card that I haven't seen in a long while, so I thought I would give it a mention, Vicious Shadows, 6 and a red enchantment. Whenever a creature dies, you may have Vicious Shadows deal damage to target player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. Really great mono red win con, I think. Creatures are dying all over the place all the time. This is 7 mana, that's a lot, but this just ends games a lot of the time, right? If you cast this and then on your next turn, or maybe on the same turn, you cast a Blasphemous Act, every creature dying, you may have Vicious Shadows deal damage to target player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. It doesn't matter which creature it is, right? That's what makes this card great. If you have a bunch of creatures die, for every one that dies, this triggers and you get to pick a target to take damage. It's also punishing your opponents for having lots of cards in hand, which is extra good, I think. This card ends games fast once it hits the table. It's a great win con in mono red. Coming in at number 11, Viridian Revel, 1 green enchantment. Whenever an artifact is put into an opponent's graveyard from the battlefield, you may draw a card. So this card already has been getting a little bit of buzz in the last year or so. It has been mentioned by me, by a couple other people as well. I discovered this card completely by accident while making a Kogla the Titan Ape deck way back when Ikoria came out, because I thought, okay, well, I'm going to be destroying my opponent's artifacts and enchantments, why don't I find some way to get a benefit off of that, other than the obvious one, right? And I started looking for, what if my opponent's artifacts die? Can I get something out of it? I came across this card and I'm like, wow, that's really good. And just as it happens, treasure tokens were exploding in the format, and it became really, really good because this card does not care about non-token. So of course, this card has just become way, way better. It has already gotten a lot more expensive. I mean, I picked up my copy when it was like 20 cents or something. It's getting a little more expensive. It's not too bad still. It is bananas against treasure tokens. Every time someone sacks a treasure token, you're drawing a card. It is one of the best cards out there right now to fight against those treasure tokens. Your opponents are really actually going to have to hold off on sacking their treasure tokens if they don't want to draw you a ton of cards. It's fantastic that way. Finally got to it in the alphabet, so there it is. Coming in at number 12, Void. Really fun, interesting removal spell. I think I just absolutely love the original art. When I first saw this card, I was like, what's happening here? This is like some sort of robot that's shooting guns at people. It's kind of weird in Magic, but really, really interesting card. 3 black and a red sorcery. Choose a number. Destroy all artifacts and creatures with mana value equal to that number. Then target player reveals their hand and discards all non-land cards with mana value equal to that number. So this might seem like a really bad removal spell, really bad board wipe, whatever you want to call it, but it definitely has its place, okay? Because it is a selective board wipe, right? If you just think about the removal part of it, target player reveals their hand and discards all non-land cards with that mana value. That to me is just an added bonus. If you just forget about that part and hey, I get to look at my opponent's hand, you know, and if I don't get anything out of there, oh well, that's just an added bonus for me. For me, I'm looking at the board with this card and going, okay, I have 2 opponents that both have commanders that cost 4 mana. So I'm going to pick 4 and destroy all artifacts and creatures with mana value 4. And I'm paying 5 mana to kill 2 of my opponent's commanders. That's pretty good. And then anything else I get on top of that is just bonus, in my opinion. I think just I destroy both my opponent's commanders for 5 mana is pretty darn good. Assuming, of course, I don't blow up anything on my board. It's not the greatest removal spell ever, but I just think it's a fun card in a commander game where you can continually look at the board, and if you see certain things that are in the number range that you're looking for, or in particular, if you're just desperate and you got to get a certain artifact off the table and it costs 6, you can just pick 6 just to blow up that thing. I think it's a pretty interesting card in a commander game. Coming in at lucky number 13 is Voidstone Gargoyle. 3 white gargoyle, 3/3 with flying. As Voidstone Gargoyle enters the battlefield, choose a non-land card name. Spells with the chosen name can't be cast. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated. I've always been a big fan of this card ever since I first saw it because it solves problems. I love cards that solve problems. This guy is a meddling mage and a Phyrexian Revoker combined into one. There's never going to be a game where you don't have this guy in your hand and you go, I can't really use that. You're always going to be able to use it because either your opponents have something on the battlefield with an activated ability that you want to shut off, or if they don't have that, you can just pick a spell that you don't want them to cast, particularly their commander, right? You just killed their commander. It's a really powerful commander, like a Corvald that's annoying the crap out of you. You just cast this, name Corvald, and now they can't cast it, right? It solves lots of problems. I think the activated ability one, though, is the most important one because this is activated abilities of sources with the chosen name. That's it. You can shut off any problematic permanent on the battlefield with this card. And again, if you want to go the other route and make your opponent so they can't cast their commander either, it's great there too. This is a really versatile, handy card in a commander game, I think. Coming in at number 14, Wand of Denial. 2 mana artifact. Tap. Look at the top card of target player's library. If it's a non-land card, you may pay 2 life. If you do, put it into that player's graveyard. So this card might not look like much on its face, but it really is doing something that is pretty unique. It is a repeatable way to look at the top card of someone's library and maybe throw it into their graveyard. Now, if it's a non-land card, you can throw it in their graveyard, but if it's a land, you probably don't care, right? That part is on there just so you can't mana screw your opponent, which you probably don't want to do in a commander game anyway. If it's a land, you're probably not going to care, so that part's not holding you back. This obviously works on yourself too, right? And I love cards that work on yourself or your opponents, depending on which direction you want to go. So maybe this is just, I look at my own library, and if it's not what I want, I can throw it in my graveyard, or if it's something I want in my graveyard, I can throw it in my graveyard. I had this card in my Paco and Haldan deck because I thought, wouldn't it be great to look at the top card of my opponent's library so that when I attack with my Paco, I'll actually get something that I really want. And it worked particularly good there because you want lands off of your opponent's libraries, right? You want non-creature stuff. So if I look at the top of my opponent's library and there's a creature there, I can now chuck it in their graveyard so that when I attack with my Paco, I'll get something that I can actually use. There is lots of decks like that where you maybe want to be looking at the top of your opponent's library, because if what's there you don't like, you can get rid of it. You can even just throw this in your deck to look at the top card of your opponent's library, and if it's something you don't want them to have, you chuck it in their graveyard, right? This is never not going to be a usable card in a Commander game. And it also has a fairly unique effect. Coming in at number 15, another card that I saw from time to time in Commander games, haven't seen in a long time, Ward of Bones. 6 mana artifact, each opponent who controls more creatures than you can't cast creature spells. The same is true for artifacts and enchantments. Each opponent who controls more lands than you can't play lands. Man, what a great, powerful effect in a Commander game. It is a little stacksy, I guess. It can be really, really great in certain themes. So for example, if you don't want to have any creatures, right? You board wipe, and now anyone who has more creatures than you can't cast a creature spell. So this just keeps people from having only one creature in play. It doesn't completely lock them out of playing creatures, so it's not like a really hate card like that. It does allow them to have one creature. They can have their commander, but that's it. Any go wide strategy is going to be really, really held back by this. Any super heavy artifact theme is going to be held back. Any super heavy enchantment tribal theme is going to be held back by this, right? Even if you just want to throw this in your deck because your opponents have enchantment tribal decks, artifact tribal decks, they're going to be limited to like maybe 2 or 3. However many enchantments or artifacts you have, they're going to be very limited on that. They won't be able to completely go off. And then of course it works with the lands thing as well. They can't play lands if they control more lands than you, which can be a great equalizer in a Commander game, especially if your opponent is playing that really heavy landfall theme. Coming in at number 16, probably my favorite Bant card in the Commander format, Wargate X. Blue, green, and a white. Sorcery. Search your library for a permanent card with mana value X or less and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Pretty simple. I just included this in my Pegasus Tribal deck, which I did recently, because there was a lot of important pieces in that deck that I wanted to be able to get that happened to be permanents, right? This is any permanent. Enchantment, artifacts, creatures, and yes, even lands, right? If you get a land with this, obviously a land costs 0, so this is 3 mana, a blue, green, and a white. Go get any land out of your library and put it directly into play untapped. That's actually pretty good. 3 mana to get any land, your Gaia's Cradle or whatever, put it directly into play untapped is pretty fantastic. So just that alone, I think, makes this a very playable card. I'm actually shocked it doesn't see more play. It is a pretty great tutor in the format. Yes, it is 3 colors, so it's very limited in the decks you can put it in, but any Bant deck that I'm making, this guy's going right in there. Coming in at 17, Warping Whale. 1 in a colorless mana. And this will be the only card that I mention on my entire series that has the colorless mana symbol in its casting cost. It is an instant, and you can choose 1. Exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less. That's a very usable ability in a Commander game, right? This will exile a Thrasios, for example. There's lots of creatures with power or toughness 1 that you can exile with this. Pretty handy. You can also create a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token that you can sacrifice to add a mana. That's okay, I guess. The best one here, though, is counter target sorcery spell. This is a colorless counter spell. I mentioned this on my non-blue counter spells video, right? Because it is a non-blue counter spell just for sorceries, though. But in the Commander format, that really is the thing that you want to be countering, right? The sorceries are all the best ones. All those really powerful game-ending spells are going to be sorceries. The Expropriates, the Torment of Hellfires, stuff like that. And this is such a gotcha moment. It doesn't get much better than this, in my opinion. If you're in like that mono red deck or that mono green deck or that colorless deck, countering your opponent's Expropriate with this is just a moment that every Commander player could live for, I imagine. Now, of course, you need the colorless mana, right? You do have to be careful there. If you're going to put this in your mono white deck or your mono red deck or something like that, you do need that colorless pips, right? So you need a land that produces colorless mana in order to cast this. That is the little bit of drawback, but in a monocolored deck, typically you do have a fair amount of those lands kicking around that you can use for this. It is very niche, but man, it can be great in certain situations. Coming in at number 18, Well of Knowledge. 3 mana artifact. Pay 2, draw card. Any player may activate this ability, but only during their draw step. This is just such a weird, unique, interesting card, and I think it could be really fun in a Commander game. Now, obviously, you can put this in a hug deck, and just allow any of your opponents to draw during their draw step, paying 2. However, I really think this can be a great strategy piece in a commander game as well. Now, obviously, you can pay 2 during your draw step if you need to draw extra cards. It also entices your opponents to do so, which I think is interesting. So on your opponent's draw step, they're sitting there going, okay, well, I'm drawing 1 card on my draw step. I can pay 2 and draw another one if I want, and it'll end up maybe playing into their greed a little bit where they're paying mana to draw more cards, but then they're tapping themselves down on their turn so that they can't do stuff with them. I think that could be a really interesting dynamic. Is there a specific deck this goes in? You can't force draws here. You're just giving your opponent the opportunity. Maybe if you're in a Necrosar deck or something like that, it could fit. You could get the draws off of it. Your opponents probably don't want to use it or they'll take the damage. If they do draw, they're taking the damage, so that's a win for you anyway. Can be good in a deck where you're enticing your opponents to have a bigger hand, like maybe a Sizan deck. Again, if they forego it, then you're the only person taking advantage of this, so it's, again, a win-win situation for you. It's a really interesting card that I think could fit in a few decks. Coming in at number 19, a card that I will be absolutely lambasted in the comments section if I don't give a mention in this series, because I've had at least 6 or 7 people say, how about this card? Gotta mention it on your series, and I've finally gotten to it, of course, almost at the end. Wheel of Sun and Moon. 2 hybrid Selesnya mana, so 2 white-green mana, enchantment Aura, and it is an enchant player. If a card would be put into enchanted player's graveyard from anywhere, instead that card is revealed and put on the bottom of that player's library. So this card might not seem like much on its face. Again, it's one of those cards that is kind of unassuming, but it is really doing a lot. First of all, as I just mentioned, it is a card that is targeting a player. So we can use it on our opponents or we can use it on ourselves. Why do you want to use it on yourself? Well, helps against milling. I've actually had a couple people like, man, I need some answers. My opponents are milling me out all the time. I don't think milling's particularly good in Commander, but if you're losing to mill all the time, this completely shuts it down, right? If a card would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, so if it's milled, instead you put it on the bottom of your library. So milling does absolutely nothing against you if this card is in play. If there is just important cards in your deck that you don't want to be losing, right? Because this is player's graveyard from anywhere. If your creatures die and you have a lot of creature tutoring, so maybe you're in a Sisay deck, for example, this could be a great fit because now my legendary creature dies, goes to my graveyard, or my legendary artifact dies, goes to my graveyard, and then I can immediately go tutor for it again, right? So if I have a really important piece in a deck that I am able to tutor for, I don't have to worry about it getting out of the graveyard because it'll go back on my library and I can go get it again. But also can be used on your opponents. If your opponent is playing a Marin deck, I put this on my opponent, targeting them, and now anything that goes into their graveyard goes on the bottom of their library. And this is a replacement effect. This is if instead, right? Those are the words you want to be looking for with those replacement effects. So they won't be getting any dice triggers out of this. They will be getting 0 experience counters with their Marin deck if this is in play, because if a creature they control dies, instead, it's going to go on the bottom of their library. It's never going to hit their graveyard. So they will get 0 experience counters there. Also, they just can't fill their graveyard at all. This is a great graveyard hate card. If it goes into their graveyard from anywhere, it goes on the bottom of their library instead. So any graveyard theme is going to be completely hated out of the game by this card. Really great, versatile card. Also, the art is fantastic. I've always loved the art on this card as well. There you go, all those people who were mentioning in the comments. There's the card. I hope I did it justice. My last card that I will be ever mentioning on this series, though, is one of my personal favorites that I think, again, is a super versatile card that doesn't get nearly enough love, and that is World Queller. Now, unfortunately, this card is the opposite of the last one, where I absolutely hate the art. I hate it. That art is awful. Oh, I've always hated the art on this card. It really bugs me. I wish they would reprint it with better art. But it is a 3 white avatar 4/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may choose a card type. If you do, each player sacrifices a permanent of that type. This is a fantastic effect in a Commander game. Now, I have this in a few decks, okay? First deck I have it in is my Gerard deck. And the reason I have my Gerard deck is because that is a both sacrifice artifact and sacrifice creature theme. I'm sort of doing a slingshot effect with my commander. I have ETB creatures like a Dyrgar Hedge Mage where I can sacrifice it, get it back, and then I get that ETB again. So I'm going to choose creature at the beginning of my upkeep, and then everyone's going to have to sacrifice a creature, right? So I'm forcing my opponents to sacrifice a creature. I want to sacrifice a creature. That's where this guy becomes extra good. Not only are you doing something you want to, you're forcing forcing your opponents to all sacrifice a creature as well. Maybe I'm in my Dennick deck. Again, the other deck where I use this card. You can check out my gameplay video where I play my Dennick deck and I get my World Queller out and see how I actually use it. And we actually made a mistake in that video because you cannot respond to the choice that I make. That's what makes this card extra good. At the beginning of your upkeep, I get to choose a permanent type. It's chosen upon resolution, so my opponents now have to respond without knowing the choice that I am making. I can't say artifact and then have my opponents sacrifice their commander's sphere in response. They have to sacrifice their commander's sphere first, thinking that I might say artifact, right? They have to make some tough decisions based on what I might choose. The other place where this is great is this is any permanent, guys. You can choose lands here, okay? If you're in a lands theme in white and you got lots of lands, you can start making your opponents sacrifice their lands. The other great place here is if you don't have a permanent of that type at all. If you're going around the table and you get to your upkeep and your opponent is playing a Purphoros deck and you don't have any enchantments, you just pick enchantment. You don't have to sacrifice nothing and your opponent has to sacrifice their Purphoros. I really like this card against Planeswalkers because I don't have Planeswalkers in any of my decks. So if my opponents at all are playing Planeswalkers, I can just choose Planeswalker on my upkeep. They have to sacrifice theirs. Of course, doesn't hurt me at all. This is such a fantastic card. There's a million different ways to use it. I would love to see it played more in the format. I mean, I might regret saying that, but I think it's a fantastic card that can fit in a ton of strategies and also can just fit in any deck and be a great repeatable removal option for you. But that is it. That is all. That is the end of this series. Like I said, stay tuned for my next video, which will be another 20 cards you should be putting in your commander decks, where I'm going to go back, look at all of those old cards and make some suggestions for the ones that I really think need to see more play in the format. And also for all the people out there that have been watching my channel for a long time now, simply because of this series, and they're sort of bummed out and they're like, oh, no more old card suggestions. I will be starting a new series in a couple of weeks, probably. The best cards from each set. Okay, that's going to be my new series, sort of talking about older, jankier cards. I'm going to be going back to a lot of the older sets in particular and talking about the best cards from each one for Commander. So stay tuned for that as well. But that is it for today. And thanks for tuning in.